All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the land of plaid and coffee. This is David, and let me grab a sip of the old coffee here, real quick. All right, so I do, still have a little here and there, so please forgive me of that. But I will never apologize for the coffee. I'll tell you that. Here's what's going on. I've got some really important and awesome updates and news coming from PacWest Bigfoot this next week. And I just want to say, first and foremost, thank you so very much for being here. These encounter stories like this one right here, which I have to say, here's the deal. My father, up until he passed away in 2015, owned a carpet cleaning business in the Rogue Valley between 1984, 1985, I think is when he started it. And between then and he passed away, he had run that carpet cleaning business, and we used to go out to this area, this neck of the woods, and actually up this road that these folks live on. So I know this area personally, and it's pretty darn Bigfooty out there, if you ask me. So there you go. But anyways, before we get into the encounter story this week, just want to say thank you so very much for being here and allowing me to try to do some justice in turning your reports and your experiences into these awesome campfire-like stories that you claim are awesome. It really is. It's just an amazing opportunity. And I know that you guys are wanting me to do a lot more, and so I'm going to be working on that, and I've got some really awesome news for you next week, and I'll let you in on that. I'm very nervous about it, but it's about time, so I'll let you know then. With that, let's get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot Encounters story, the Bigfoot Thief of Shady Cove. And yes, I will pause for some sips of the old Sasquatch coffee along the way. We still live here in the same home and run the same small farm, even after the wife and I had a big scare from a very, very frightening Bigfoot on the property a while back. I did fear for our lives, but in the end, the Bigfoot ended up just a thief. A scary one, but a harmless thief nonetheless. Plus, it ended up something else, as you'll see. Here's what happened to us back in the late 1990s on our new farm at the time, just outside of Shady Cove, Oregon. The Thief of Shady Cove. After serving 4 years in the Army, I received my degree in agriculture at Boise State. Go Buster Bronco. However, I'm also a Ducks fan, as I was born and raised in Oregon, Medford, Oregon. Coming home to start a farm was the plan after college. However, an encounter with a myth was not. Before that happened, though, I graduated, married my college sweetheart, Elaine, and we moved to the Rogue Valley, to a small farm just outside the town of Shady Cove, to be exact. We were just east of town before the bridge. There are two roads that turn off Highway 62. And if you head up into the hills east, we lived about nothing but about a couple miles up them. One of them. We love it here. The farm, the town, and the fishing is great along the Rogue River. Elaine chose the property, so for that I still joke with her about choosing a farm full of monsters. But there are no monsters any longer. At least they do not hang around here that we know of. I do think they pass through the area a couple times a year, and I will share with you why I believe that. But for now, here's what that rather scary event in time on the farm ended up being. It actually started when we first moved in. I was not all surprised that some animals were visiting regularly. It still smelled like a farm, even though it had not been lived in or on in over 2 years before us. It was not abandoned, not by any means. The owners had eventually passed away, and the children who lived in the area had put it up for sale, but not after squabbling about it first. It had everything we needed for raising some sheep and a few cattle, not to mention my wife was into gardening, and I would grow seasonal vegetables and other plants to sell locally. She actually got into selling soap and such, made from sunflowers for a while. But right after we moved in, we started to notice a few odd things about the place. Some of it was just feelings, and I will explain that in a moment. And the other was the sounds we'd both hear from time to time at night. Feelings. Nothing more than. My wife was and is an early bird. As for myself, I tried to sleep in a bit longer than her. She was up with her flowers and such every morning before the sun could even show itself. Me, I was raising a small herd of cattle as well. barely 20 heads of cow and 12 to 15 sheep. At the time I had 15 sheep, but I ended up losing 2. Anyway, my wife was always in that garden and early. It was the first Friday of that September morning when she was out there getting ready for the open market, the farmer's market, in Medford the next day. It was odd, she said, but for some reason she felt like she was being watched the whole morning. As she pruned, picked, and put things in her basket, she would find the hair on the back of her neck stand straight up here and there. There were no sounds, no nothing, just a feeling of being watched all morning. I did warn her of mountain lions. There are many, many of them around the area, and have been known to come running through town on occasion. We both thought, after that, to have the old Winchester 30-30 loaded and taken with her in the mornings from that point on. So she did. Still, the following week, and on at least 2 occasions I recall, she'd come in from breakfast and stated she felt as if she was being watched. However, the second time she actually walked out to the tree line and looked around. I was not too happy with that decision. So, I decided I would look from now on. A week later, I was out taking a walk up the hill, our low-lying hills behind the property, with a rifle in hand. There were plenty of mountain lion tracks, but most looked rather old, except one set. There were also some old bear tracks, but those had to come from months before we moved in. Deer could be found anywhere and some raccoon. But it was not until I hit a rocky outcropping way up the mountainside that I found what seemed to look like footprints, human-like ones. I was never a believer in Bigfoot, although I heard everything about them growing up in the Pacific Northwest. But I hiked up to the top of that outcrop of rocks and stood on top of them. Funny enough, I could see the farm clearly from that point, and almost the whole entire property, including the house, one of the outbuildings, and yes, the massive garden my wife tended. I looked around at the 2 or 3 outlines that seemed to be footprints, and finally decided that they had to be the back paws of a very large black bear. Maybe that is what was standing up there, staring down at the farm and making her feel uncomfortable. Or so I thought. That's not an owl. Life continued on the farm, even the weird feelings. Soon after my walk up the mountain, I started getting that feeling of being watched myself while out and about on the farm. It was such an eerie feeling, too. Just weird. But when I did, I looked up the mountain, but I could not see that outcropping from there, or for that matter, what was watching me from it. It was finally late September when we started hearing some strange things, and it was right before some pretty scary moments that would happen to us. Actually, at first I thought it was an owl hooting one night, but it couldn't have been. See, I was laying in bed that night, and still being some pretty warm days in Oregon in late September, as usual, I left the window open to our bedroom, which was in the back southeast corner of the house, nearest the tree line and hills. I was groggy and started to doze off a bit, but I was still somewhat awake when I heard some hooting. But it was not hooting. I was actually hearing. The mind, I suppose, it can play tricks from time to time. When I was fully awake and heading over to shut the window, I could hear that the hooting was more like whooping. What in the heck whoops in the woods? Whoop, whoop. I mean, seriously, it was very weird and even troubling sound come from back in the woods. I was going to wake my wife to come and listen, but before I could, it stopped. I shut the window and laid there thinking for a bit about what I just heard. It was truly something I had never heard before, something that made me a bit nervous. The next morning I found myself getting up with the wife from there on out, helping her and getting to my own work earlier. I was not taking any chances. I told her what I'd heard, and to my surprise she mentioned she'd heard it too. She never told me because she thought it was just a very large owl, or some weird, sound from a mountain lion, which, by the way, can have some pretty strange sounds emanate from them. But I told her it was not it, and it wasn't. Richard, what is that? The last week of September had us frightened, scared, and even called the sheriff out once. While the deputy and her partner claimed it was just a person, my wife almost had some words for them. It was not a person we saw, and it was something else altogether. We respect authority, however, and while my wife told them what it was, she told them with all due respect, but they just didn't listen. We were on our own after that, but here's the rest of that story. Elaine was just getting out of the shower and decided to stand out on the small deck and patio outside the sliding glass door of our bedroom when she'd seen it. A wine glass in hand, it was dusk, practically dark when she sat on one of the new wicker chairs I'd purchased in Medford earlier that week for that purpose. It really is beautiful out here, and the sunsets over the hills and mountains are rather breathtaking. But as she sat staring up and over the hills, she said she'd caught some movement out of the corner of her eye. She looked quickly over near the shed in the barn, scanned for a second or so, and then looked right back at the sunset. That is when she practically choked on her wine. She said she'd seen it on the first look, but her mind did not catch up until a few seconds later. But she turned her head around again, and there it was. It was like a statue, she said, tall, dark, and the eyes seemed to almost glow or shimmer in what dim light was available. Either way, she looked on for what seemed a few or more seconds when it finally moved. She said it suddenly darted towards her and then angled off abruptly back up into the hillside and into the woods. As it crashed through the trees and brush, she swore she heard it, well, mumbling or talking in some kind of gibberish. She said it was really tall, probably as tall as the top part of the barn doors, which are 8 feet off the ground. It was dark, covered in hair, and its arms reached its knees, and even though she said they were swinging once it moved off. She was not sure about the face, but the eyes were very, very menacing, with that flickering or glint of red in them. It moved, she said, gracefully, almost like if it were a cross-country skier with a bit of ice skater to them. I heard her drop the glass and call my name. I ran to her from the shower, and while I saw nothing, I could tell by her panic and fear she had 2 for the price of 1. I was on alert. Elaine was hysterical for a day or two. She did tend her garden, of course, but I had to be there all the time, then, rifle and all. I don't blame her, because what I saw next almost had us moving. A few days later, and both of us had seen and heard nothing, so we finally started relaxing a bit. I guess that was the wrong thing to do, relax with such a big problem around. It was morning, and Elaine and I were in the garden when I noticed part of the fence had been mangled. Not broken or crushed, just mangled a bit, like someone had messed around with it to get over it. And someone or something did, as there was a dead lamb laying there. No head, hind legs gone, and weird as it may seem, it was or looked like it was literally snapped in half, like bent in two backward. Not to mention the gut was ripped open, and missing were the liver, kidneys, and lungs that I could tell. It was a horror of a scene. My wife was pretty aghast of what she was looking at, and I was both freaked out and, to be honest, ticked off from losing an animal. That's money. That night I would stand guard as long as I could, protecting my animals, my business, if you will. But I fell asleep, and that cost me. The next morning, another lamb. Well, sheep this time, as it was about a 3-year-old that was lying bloody and dead with a snapped back again. No head, missing a leg, and the same innards gone. I was livid. We left the sheriff out of it, and I took to hunting this thing. The hunt is on. I hate crazy violence. But if you're stealing from me, expect it. If it is an animal stealing from me, I know I will hunt it, kill it, and if it is edible, I'll eat it too, and just for spite. I took to finding and eradicating this thing, this Bigfoot we'd come to discover that it was that first night Elaine had seen it. I had decided to study up a bit and had picked up a book in town about them, this creature called Bigfoot. I have to say, I was learning a lot with a book by Mr. William Jebning. I was also becoming a bit scared and freaked out, but I would walk the hillside over the next week, early in the mornings, while Elaine worked her garden looking for a sign of this thing. Nothing. I found nothing. I figured I might never find it. I even hiked up to the rocky outcropping to look for track and other signs of this thing being around. All I got was that feeling of being watched, but nothing else. I did let off a shot and hiked back down to the house. I must have got its attention because that night I'd be shooting at it, I think. Shots fired, shots fired. Screaming, and it was not from the woods. It was from my wife. She was looking out the window of the bedroom as it had become second nature for her by that point. She always checked now before stepping outside onto the patio. It was there, right by the house, and as she screamed, it literally hit the side of the house with its hands really hard. I could hear it all the way from the opposite side of the house. It was so hard. But unfortunately for that thing, I had my gun by the door, and I was still ticked off. I ran out of the living room door, past the front porch, and around the side of the house with rifle raised like I was back in the army again. I saw that thing too. It was huge. I mean, Dave, this thing was scary huge, and it looked as though it could tear me in half, let alone a small sheep or lamb. It stopped right at the edge of the woods that bordered the back part of the yard. It stared right at me, just standing there, staring, and it seemed to be breathing pretty heavy, and his chest was moving in and out fast. It also had, well, what looked like breasts. Not big ones. I do not mean to sound weird, but they seemed to be small, female-like breasts. Her shoulders were massive as well, and muscular. The shoulders had to be at least 3 feet wide or so, period. The hair was sort of long, but not too long. Watching the Patterson-Gimlin film later on, that seemed to be a pretty close fit. But this one was a bit more lean, I guess you'd say. The face, however, is what caught my attention the most. It was dark, covered in hair below the nose, and almost black-skinned. Its nose was sort of flat, and the eyes were huge, dark, and menacing. However, there was the glint of red my wife had mentioned. But I believe came from the reflection of light that was left before nightfall. It started to growl and opened its mouth that was extremely large and scary as well. I raised my gun back up, aimed, and was about to pull the trigger when it looked to its right. I looked over there, and there was another one. This one was small, about maybe 3 foot, jet black, clinging to a tree. It was a mother. I couldn't fire. I couldn't shoot it. As much as I wanted to, I just couldn't. So instead, I fired in the air, and I fired off several shots as they ran off, right over their heads. She was not without the noise when she leapt out of there, however. All the way up and into the forest, we could hear her screaming on and off. It was crazy. It was a crazy few moments that had both of us ready to leave that minute. Home sweet home. We stayed. We did not move. We held our ground. It was at least 3 to 4 days after that when I would catch myself looking up towards that rocky outcropping and wondering if they were gone for good, as we had seen nothing and heard not a peep for days. They were gone. By the end of October and through Christmas that year, nothing was heard or seen since. But who knows? Once in a while, we do get that feeling on the back of our necks like we're being watched, and that is when we look to the forest. But that is our encounter story. Thanks, Rich and Elaine.